I guess I'll just get started then. All right. Before I get started, I'm Sean. I'm a junior at Strake. I've been doing PF for 2 years. Today, I'm going to be giving a lecture over settler colonialism, also known as set call. I'll be teaching generally what the argument is, how to go for it, and then how to respond to it. So, just an intro. This lecture is meant for those who have somewhat of a basic knowledge of what a critique and debate is. Yet it's still a very introductory lecture, so I'm going to try to tailor it to not be super hard to understand. Um, Second thing is that I'll be focusing a lot more on what set call looks like as an argument within debate. It is still helpful to understand all of the literature and understand what it is as a concept. Yeah, I obviously do not have time to go over all of that in just this lecture, so I'll be giving some reading recommendations if you want to learn more about that, but my focus will be mainly on how it looks like in debate. There are a lot of different authors who have different theorizations of set call, but majority of this lecture will be based on Tuck and Yang's understanding, as that's the most common version read in debate. If you want to go for set call a lot, I think it's a very helpful thing to read the full paper. It's not that long. It's like I think like 20, 30 pages. But if you don't have time, you can at least read a summary of it, but it's very helpful. It gives a good sort of context and understanding. So, I'm going to start with what is settler colonialism. The dictionary definition is that it's a system of oppression based on genocide and colonialism that aims to displace the population of a nation, oftentimes indigenous people, and replace it with a new settler population. This is a whole lot of words, but the main distinction is that between settler colonialism, settler colonialism, as Tuck and Yang define it, say that it comes with an intention of making a new home. So, as opposed to other things that might be based off of like resource extraction or getting labor, etc., settler colonialism is rely on the idea that people are going to have sovereignty over everything in the new land that they're going to, and they're going to make it their new home. The reason why this is important is that this inherently disrupts the relation that whatever indigenous people have to that land and relies on a sort of logic of elimination, which is a term you'll hear a lot, which basically just means for the settler to make a new home, they have to assert their authority and their sovereignty over that land, which inherently relies on eliminating the indigenous people's sovereignty and their sort of relationship to said land. The first kind of thing you need to know is ontology. What this means is it's just a study of being, and it asks questions like what exists and how are things categorized. What this means in a debate context, it is basically your thesis claim, and it is how you shape your understanding of the world. So you can think of it like that. Um, what is the world? What relationship exists in it? And what should we do in the face of that? I.e. your alternative, but that we'll get more on that later. So in context, what settler colonialism states is that settler colonialism is not just an event that happened. It's not just that states came and they colonized certain places, but rather it's a structure that continues on until today. That comes from Patrick Wolf, who's also a great reading recommendation if you have time. What this means is that the mere existence of the state today, i.e., and this is not just mean like the United States, but any sort of settler colonialist state, it relies on the elimination of native people and the constant elimination. It's not just that they came once, enslaved people's land, but the current, like the generations of indigenous people, their sort of culture and practice is still eliminated and they still like see the effects today. And there's basically a constant, you'll see a lot of people describe it as a continuing genocide of their culture, relation to the land, etc. The next thing is that it necessitates a settler worldview, which is used to justify its structures, i.e., the state has to say that the things that they did in the past, i.e., colonizing these places and like killing millions of or the thousands of indigenous people, there has to be an idea that that was somewhat justified for the state to exist today. Um, that's under the guise of things such as like technical modernization, having some sort of establishing an order, etc., which will be more on that later. The last thing is that anything that the state tries to do to sort of fix what it did is just a move to innocence, i.e., anytime the state tries to pass policies that might be trying to help indigenous people, it's always just them trying to get rid of their guilt. And say that, hey, look, we're actually trying to help, which is just them trying to justify all the things they bad did. You can look at historical examples, i.e., like every time that the United States in the past displaced indigenous peoples, it said, hey, but we're giving you new land in this other place. But that always resulted in things such as the Trail of Tears, where thousands died and were displaced, etc. So you can never really help them. The state itself can never really help them, and anything it does will always just be a quote move to innocence. The next part of the argument is the links. These are just saying why what you have done and your research are bad and support this settler colonial structure. So I've listed just a couple of different types of links. There's obviously more, but these are the most basic ones you'll see in the debate. The first is the topic link. Um, you always see one of these. People will just read something that says that the topic and the affirmative is settler colonialist. So a couple examples are on this topic, whether the UK should rejoin the EU. People will read evidence that says that the EU is a colonialist institution, i.e., that it is it's all these like European states united, and the way that they treat states external to them, like states in the global south, Africa, etc., is they treat them as inferior and not as technologically progressed, which means that they're not allowed to be in the European Union, and there's sort of an inferior relationship there. And then logically, rejoining that institution is bad and would give it legitimacy. So the affirmative is bad. The second common link is that narratives of extinction are bad. Now, to clarify, this doesn't just say all representations or obviously like everyone dying might be a bad thing, but rather this says specifically that the root cause of the extinction claims that the affirmative will say is settler colonialism. So some examples of this is the reason we have climate change is because there's no longer that relationship to the land that indigenous people had, and rather we're focused on exploiting the land through extraction, etc., which is the root cause of climate change. And so this says that framing of extinction as sort of a universal problem that affects everyone ignores the current disproportionate violence towards indigenous people that caused those structures to exist in the first place. Again, this kind of ties back to the moves of innocence thing that most people will frame their arguments as extinction outweighs, but this is merely just and you should portray this as just the state trying to justify all its actions and bad actions, but under the guise of we're helping the greater good. But in reality, the root cause of all these things is the structure in the first place. The next most common type of link is fiat. So if you don't know what fiat is, it basically is just the process that the affirmative goes to where they say, we assume that the policy is passed and here are the effects of it. In this case, this is basically just the logic that the idea of focusing on the future and imagining future worlds is a bad thing. So, oh, and by the way, these sort of authors are just the cards that say these things. So if you want to search them up on like Logos or the wiki, you can find them. If you also just want to DM me, I can maybe send them to you. So this card is actually something that I cut. Um, and it basically says that, remember, your ontology says that the state can never be detached from the disposition it did upon indigenous people and the suffering that it caused. This means that the idea that we can pass policies by the state will always be at the cost of indigenous peoples because it's giving the state legitimacy that it does not deserve. Again, these will always be sort of moves to innocence that see to help people, but every single time you try to pass this, it's giving the state, it assumes that the state has the power to do so in the first place. But again, the state's foundations are inherently colonialist. So, in turn, the idea of solely looking for improvement allows the state to justify its sort of moves to innocence and ignore its colonial past and all the suffering caused. And it can portray the sacrifice of indigenous people as necessary for the sort of greater good and for modernization that happened in turn. Um, the last link is to sort of theory arguments, and I'll go over later why I don't think that theory arguments are a strategic way to respond to case. Specifically set call because a lot of people will have this one card. There's the main one is Bernstein and Ruiz, but there are other versions as well. But the basic idea is that the way the way that sort of settler states justified what they did is they saw indigenous thinking and indigenous practices as too alien for them and too like out of the ordinary, right? They were like stuck and lagging behind. So they used what they thought was more procedurally fair for everyone, i.e., what we were talking about over here, how it was the sacrifice for the greater good, to justify silencing and elimination of their structures and ideas. So, in the context of this round, you'll say that their guise of prioritizing what is procedurally fair is bad because there was never fairness for these indigenous and native peoples, and it was always just the idea of what benefited the settler state the more, and that was what they would call procedurally fair. You should also specify that you are not saying that fairness as a whole is bad, but specifically when it is used to justify colonialist practices and genocide, i.e., the impacts you've read off of your argument, is when it is bad, which also is useful because they're going to read arguments why just generally fairness is good, and you can stand up and say, look, we do not specifically think that fairness is bad. Rather, your usage of fairness to silence indigenous literature, etc., is a bad thing. Um, Now, the next part of the argument is your alternative. So, at this point, you've established a structure in the world. You have established why your opponents support that bad structure. Now, you have to ask, what do we do in the face of it? This is where alternative comes in. There are two different types. The first is your material alternative. So this is what you see in a lot of other types of critiques. If you know about like the CAPK, for example, your alternative is to sometimes embrace like communist practices, socialist practices, whatever. In the case of Sekol, it's decolonization. Um, Generally, this would probably entail something as giving land back to indigenous people, and their sovereignty, which would basically be just like the government going away. However, usually you will never see a team specify this because it's a very broad concept, decolonization. How is that going to happen, right? Especially in the midst of all complex governments across the world. It's happened only in the US, etc. What the team will usually say is that the idea that we have to specifically know what's going to happen is a bad thing. So the tuck and yang evidence that I have cited earlier, it also supports this and says that we should not ask questions of specifically what will materially happen, but rather we should just have decolonization as a broad goal in the first place, and that's what allows us to create actions. Because otherwise, the idea that we don't know what's going to materially happen prevents us from taking any action in the first place. Because it's an impossible question to answer. Now, the you might ask yourself, okay, I've promoted oh, and by the way, just like I'll get to all like the questions at because I just want to make sure I get through everything here first. Um but sorry, where was I? Yeah. So obviously you cannot just present this as like a good idea and immediately get to weigh its benefits. So as a negative, you sometimes get access. So we've already explained what fiat is as the affirmative. Um as a negative, in other debates, specifically in other types of debate, you have things such as like counter plans. That is what the alternative looks like, right? Obviously, if you're gonna read like a fiat link, then you probably shouldn't say that you fiat your alternative, but I'll explain more on that later. Um, but so you get to just fiat this, and you do not get to specify like you could just say we feel the decolonization happens, which will answer all the arguments as to why it like could not happen because they'll say, oh, we fiat through that stuff. Again, we'll go more on that later. But all this basically means is that the same way the affirmative assumes a world in which their arguments happen, you assume a world in which decolonization happens. However, this is not a strong argument, and I'll explain why, because there are a lot of procedural arguments that the affirmative can make as to why this is just a bad model for debate. So in my opinion, you should only ever go for this as an argument if it's just completely uncontested. More commonly, however, what you'll see people go for is an alternative of refusal. This is reliant on an argument, or like a framework of debate called you think you lose. This will be talked about more on the next slide when I go over framework. But the idea is that just generally we should reject colonialist practices, and that's the only way to set the stage for decolonization. Um, so you'll just say, even if we do not like get rid of all colonial structures, they've supported something that is bad, and that should be just rejecting them should be sufficient. So now it's framework. This is where Psycho will differ from a lot of other critiques that you might have seen, like the CapK, because you will read arguments as to why the affirmative. So there's a card called Brifkin, and it claims that you will read it and you'll claim that the affirmative is an object of research and focusing only on the material benefits and harms of a policy is bad. And support a thing called settler common sense, where you just only focus on policies and nothing else. Um, what's commonly called is you're seeing the affirmative as a research project. The example that most people use is that if you wrote an essay for a teacher and you explained how you solve extinction, but you were racist in it and maybe you said like a bunch of slurs or something like that, you would get a zero on the project. It doesn't matter that you explain how you could solve extinction because you explaining that does not mean it actually gets enacted. I.e., like voting for the affirmative does not mean that you pass a policy. You do not pass that the UK joins the EU and you solve extinction. But if they have done something problematic, you should reject them for that because what they say in the round does have real world effects on rural people. Um, that's where you'll see things such as a rule of the ballot. Again, the text of these will differ. Sometimes it's just to reject settler practices. Sometimes it's to make the space alien to the settler. All these different things. Usually, the text of it does not matter, but sometimes you can go for tricky arguments. As you know, we specifically have read that your role as a judge is to do this, and anything else, they do not get to play the offense under. Again, it's a silly argument. I'll explain why it's silly later. But a lot of PF judges like this types of arguments. So I generally think that you should read some sort of rule of the ballot. Other justifications for framework are what's called the pathology disad. All this means is that and I'll explain this more later, but the affirmative's counter argument to this is that no, we should only focus on material policies and you should weigh like solving for extinction versus whatever their impacts are. You will say that this is a bad idea because the affirmative will always stand up and say extinction outweighs, which will allow them to do whatever they want in the round. They could say a bunch of slurs, they could do the most problematic thing ever, but they would always win because they would always say extinction outweighs. And you say that is obviously a bad model of debate and trivializes real world violence. The second argument you have to make is ballot solvency, right? You've established now sometimes you'll make argument and actually what the first argument is the golden rule. This basically says that we don't need to win that we like change any racist practices, but rather that you should just reject them on face. Anything else would send a signal to like any sort of like rejecting racist arguments on face. Anything else would send a signal to like minority debaters that we don't really care about them, which is obviously exhausting for them to hear that, right? And it's just generally like an intuitive argument. Like, just we do not need to win that we solve like all racial structures, but you know the racism is bad, and you should just reject it just because it is, not because we need to actually materially change anything. The second argument is that debate shapes subjectivity. What this means is that when we come to our debate rounds, we change people's minds. So usually people read a card for this. I think the most common one is Ingram, which basically just says repeated exposure and engagement with arguments can change your ideas. I.e., if you're exposed to like call over and over and over again, maybe you'll eventually you'll stop defending the topic and you'll do something else. And it'll change your practices. Obviously, like if you lost to an argument over and over again, or if you lost reading an argument over and over again, you're probably not going to read that argument anymore because you don't win with it. Last argument is norming, which is actually what I just explained. And it's just that like the way in which we vote changes people's practices in debate. Last argument that I think is important is that you should explicitly flag that you only need to win one link, and if you win framework, you should win the debate. The idea behind this is it does not matter if they've answered like 30 of your other links as to why they were settler colonialists, because it does not matter if someone didn't do 30 racist things, but they did do one racist thing. You'd still reject them for it. Now I'm gonna go over how to respond to that call. First thing, so in generally, you should respond to each argument and each type of argument that's made. You want to cover your ground, but I'll explain which arguments I think are the most important. So starting with ontology, the main response here is that progress is possible. Specifically, progress to the state is possible. So there are a couple different arguments here. The first is that biases are malleable. All this means is that even if, or the way you should frame it specifically in the context of this debate, is even if the state itself can't change, you can change individual people's biases, which means that they will be less colonialist, racist, etc., which means that the state can still do net positive things to sort of combat these. The second is that inherency decreases faith in the state. All inherency means is that the reason why we have a debate topic is because we know it's not like passing, usually, right? Obviously, we would not debate a resolution that we knew that the government was going to do in like 2 weeks because that defeats the point of debating it, right? So that's what inherency means. And all this is saying is that it decreases faith in the state. What this means is that you're not legitimizing the state, but rather you're pointing out flaws in it, i.e., that it's never going to pass this policy, which is a reason why it's bad. So you're not defending the state, but you're rather saying this is why it's bad, which means that you don't sort of tie into their ontology, right? The last thing, or sorry, not the last thing, the next thing is that they're pessimistic, right? Obviously, the idea that we cannot do anything with the state kind of sounds like we should just do nothing. They will provide their alternative, but you should have a sort of more realistic approach to this. Like, and I'll go over this more later, but the idea that we can just randomly say that everything becomes decolonized is severely utopian is the word for it. But rather we should look for real world solutions through the state. And I'll explain why that's more important later. Lastly are these two cards that are commonly read. The first is Noise Cat, and this just says that there's empirical examples of progress. There's things like this, the Red Power movement, which was a group of young indigenous people who came up and like combated the state, did things such as protests, etc., and got more rights and got like some of their authority over their land back. Lastly is the Lightfoot card, and this just says that understanding the state is important and good for decolonization. Um, Basically, this argument is that the state is very powerful now, and I'll go over this more later. But if you just tried to decolonize and I don't know, you got up and started doing protests, the government would do things such as use their military to crack down. You can especially like highlight in like the context of like like when people tried to do protests in Chicago and like the National Guard was sent. All this stuff would most likely happen if we tried to decolonize now. So rather, we need to research flaws within the state, i.e., looking through the affirmative, and find different ways in which we can sort of solve from within. The next thing is responding to your links. So the first thing that you can do is your general link turns. All this basically means is that you're saying what your impact is bad for indigenous people, but don't just say extinction because we've already established before that they'll probably just read extinction links are bad. But usually these are pretty intuitive to think of. So an example is on the nuclear energy topic, for example. A lot of people will read arguments about like nuclear energy is colonialist because of like the waste it produces and stuff. But what we did is we wrote an argument about like a certain type of reactors like called IFRs, which actually don't produce waste or reuse the waste and stuff like that. And so you can say right now we have all these nuclear reactors that produce waste, but the affirmative invests in these new types which actually reduce the waste, which is beneficial for indigenous people. Second thing is maybe your argument is about like deterring Russia, and you would say, well, imagine what like a Russia world order would look like. Probably bad for certain minorities, and there would be overall poor conditions and stuff like that, and just over authoritarian structures. There are also cards that say this, and so it's probably beneficial to read those. The second is like, for example, on this topic, there's a circular economy argument. This is explicitly about reducing resource extraction and stuff like that. Which you'll say is beneficial and solves like the exploitation of indigenous people, indigenous land and stuff like that. There's also some just general arguments that like even if they win that maybe the EU is bad, the UK joining it could reform it. They could pass certain policies, do stuff like that. You definitely need a card for this because they also might read evidence that like the UK is colonialist. Um, but it's just some general ideas to have. The last thing you want to establish is that material impacts justify representations. Because obviously they're going to make arguments, and sometimes they'll make this in framework why like fiat is illusory, which just means you don't actually pass your affirmative. But what you could say is that they have critiqued the material impacts of our arguments. For example, their arguments about why the EU is colonialist rely on the fact that the UK would actually rejoin it and legitimize the institution. So obviously, as that is true, if we read reasons why the impacts of our arguments are good and like ethical, then that would logically mean that our representations are also ethical. Now, responding to the individual links. So this will obviously differ round by round, and I can't just tell you how you respond to every single link, although I wish I could. But I can give you some general ideas on how you could go about this and how you can think about it. The first is that winning ontology answers some of their links. For example, if they read like the fiat links or if they read the state is bad, if you prove that progress is possible, that would logically answer both of those. You should portray it as their arguments are like homogenizing and say that generally the state is bad, but we have specific instances of beneficial policies that we can do that have real world impacts that not only help like general people, but also help indigenous people, etc. Which means that, like for example, in the context of the EU, it might not be bad in all instances, and there is progress within it that can make it good. Um, just generally, it is important to at least have some ink on each of the links. Even if you don't think response is the best, you can still say it because I'll explain this later. Um, if you lose framework and you do not respond to a link, they will win the round, like almost every single time. If they're like pretty competent and the judge is competent. So you should just have at least some arguments on the links. And maybe you can also just say you can do some if you don't, you can do some comparison. For example, if you have one of these link terms, you can say that outweighs their links to our arguments for XYZ. Now responding to the alternative, there are two things you could do. First is just the alternative generally fails. Um, an interesting argument that people make is like a China impact turn, which basically is a little more specific. If they clarify that the alternative is just about like decolonizing the U.S., you could say without the government, other worse countries like China would take power, and they are just more colonialist and worse and treat people worse, which would be bad. And also, you could say it like causes war, whatever, extinction. But you obviously want to focus on like you've already established those arguments. You want to focus on what answers theirs. The second is just that there are crackdowns. I explained this earlier. But like the National Guard, like if you try to do purges, if we try to dismantle the government in today's age, it just would not work, right? You cannot just like merely say we're gonna decolonize without having a planned approach and just happen. Um, that's what this next thing is that lack of understanding, or sorry, this is a lack of understanding is bad. That just means that without understanding how the government works and without working in it, you're never going to be able to actually materialize their alternative. And you can make reasons why that would outweigh maybe their arguments about just like rejecting you as a team. The last thing you should say is that you should make sure why their alternative cannot solve your arguments. So, as I explained before, they might say things such as like decolonizing solves climate change, or maybe if you decolonize the entire world, there would be no like nuclear weapons or wars to fight, whatever. So you should give reasons why the alternative cannot solve the case. Obviously, if you do all these things, it's like defense to their alternative is a way you can think about it. But you can also read procedural arguments as to why picks are bad. All a pick is a planned inclusive critique. All that means is that it's a critique of your arguments, but it also like includes solving your arguments. Mm. That's not like the exact definition, but that's probably the best way for you to understand it. So you should just maybe read certain reasons why. Like obviously, if you cut your arguments well, you'll have reasons why specifically whatever the affirmative is key, and you can just explain that. The second thing, responding to alternative, are perms, and then there's procedural. So I'll start with the perm. All perm is it's called a test of competition. You'll hear that phrasing a lot. All that means is it's deciding, can we do their alternative and can we do our affirmative? Like, are they exclusive with each other, right? Obviously, the neg is not able to just get up and say we should do X, and just get away with it. There has to be something that is a logical opportunity cost to the affirmative. So, and this is the same thing that applies to like counter plans, but obviously, they're not super common in PF. So, understanding these things is very important. So, the first thing that you could say is perm double bind. What this means is that either their alternative is super strong that, oh, and it's important to establish that usually the way the negative establishes competition, the reason why they're exclusive is because of the links they have read to your affirmative, i.e., if you are colonialist, you cannot decolonize at the same time. The first thing I'll say is perm double bind. Um, this just means that either their alternative is super good and it can overcome all the like certain military crackdowns, all that stuff in the status quo, which means it should definitely be able to overcome our affirmative, or it's not strong enough, which means it'll just get cracked down upon. Um, the second argument is perm do the alternative, um, which just means that you should be able to do their arguments if, right, the alternative is like an opportunity cost, and you cannot do it with the affirmative. And that means winning your case arguments would prove that extinction outweighs, um, right, and it would prove that they can't solve both. This is not as strong of an argument because they can probably cross apply a lot of other things, but might be unfortunate to make. This last one is just perm, or I don't, yeah, perm do the alt in the affirmative, but without our bad representations. All this is saying is that they do not get to compete based off of how we've represented our arguments, if they're not functionally competitive, i.e., if they don't physically do different things, just because like there should be a way in which our affirmative you can do it without those representations. The next arguments are just procedural arguments as why they do not get to use the alternative. The first is that the neg does not get fiat. Pretty self-explanatory. In public forum, the general understanding is that counterplans are not allowed. So an alternative would also not be allowed. You can read arguments as to why this is unfair or bad for clash, etc. Again, I'm not going to go in depth on all of those, but you can find lots of lectures that talk about that. Come on. The second is that there should be no utopian fiat. What this means is that the negative should not be able to stand up and say, like the world peace kind of plan, for example, which just says like the world should have peace and we should not fight wars. Obviously, that's unrealistic and will never happen. you want to specify this as much as possible. So you should just say like they have to specify maybe like a specific policy that we would pass or something like that. And then this is utopian because you could just say we should get rid of all death, but obviously you can't do that, and it's bad for things such as education. It specifically applied to like education about their arguments. The last is there's no philosophical competition. Um, this is similar to what we talked about here, and it's just that their alternative should not be able to compete based off of our representations, but rather there should be some functional difference. Um, so yeah, keep in mind this is very important. You should not spend a lot of time on this because most teams will not go for a mature alternative, but rather they because all these arguments, like especially like current double bind and like crackdowns, are all very true. So they usually go for refusal. That's where framework comes in. This is what you should be spending most of your time on. And I don't have enough time in this lecture to go over it specifically, but there are a lot of great lectures out there. And you can find on YouTube. And if you ask me questions on specific ones, you can DM me on Discord. My name is just Shaan. Yeah. But I'll go over it quickly. First is the interpretation. So this is like you can think of it almost like a theory argument, except it isn't. It's rather just telling the judge how they should evaluate the debate. So this is saying the judge should only look at the desirability of the plan, and they should weigh the benefits of the plan versus unique and causal links. That means that they cannot just say that we are colonialist, but rather they have to prove that we are like the sole cause of settler colonialism, which obviously is not true. Um, that's what that means. This is the highest layer of debate, which is why I should spend the most time on it. Obviously, none of the other arguments matter if you win that you should only evaluate who like the impacts off of the resolution. In that case, only you have an extinction impact, so you would automatically win. The impacts of this are fairness and clash. I'll quickly explain why each of these is true. The first is just they can pick any minor representation, which infinitely expands their topic literature into a billion different things. Additionally, they can research the same argument over and over again and practice it for 4 years, but you have to change your topic every 2 months. Um, some other reason is that they can pick out even like a certain unhighlighted line of your argument and they can win off of it, but you only get to, weigh the benefits of the highlighted line, stuff like that. And obviously, if it's unfair, you're not prepared to answer their argument, which is bad for clash. You can also read just a card that says extinction outweighs here. For the thing I did above. All this can be. I think some common ones are like Zimmer or McCaskill. These are just useful for you can just say. I mean, like you can also just do it analytically. You can just say it's a death and suffering of 8 billion people. Yada yada yada. You don't necessarily need a card, but sometimes it might be helpful. Again, I would recommend looking at YouTube specific videos specifically about how to go for framework. You can DM me if you have questions. Just some extra arguments that you can go for. First is that tab solves. So if we really did something that colonialist or racist, you should call a tab room and like get them to like intervene. The benefits of this are one, are false positives. Um, they could just go up and call a bunch of novices racists, and they will not know how to defend themselves, which means that they falsely get equated as such, just because they couldn't technically debate out of it. Um, the second is like the opposite to that is what if an opponent was severely problematic, but they simply just out debated you. Um, Obviously that is a bad model of debate. The lastly is just and this is an answer to like subject to actually I'll just do this here. The next thing is you answer ballot solvency. This kind of goes hand in hand with tab solves. It's basically technically getting people to ballot is bad. The first is double down. We will not think that your arguments are true, but rather we're just going to think about how to beat them. So when you read your argument on us, we're not going to think, oh, we're not going to switch our practices, but we're going to research why your arguments are wrong, which is causing us to be more racist colonialist in the long term. The next is guilt persuasion. This has to do with the judge. If they vote for you, they'll think that they've done enough to solve for colonialism or racism because they think they've created real world change, which prevents them from going and doing things in the real world. Both of these you can say outweigh because they're not limited to debate, but they affect how we are when we leave the activity. And debate only lasts like 4 years, yada yada yada. And the last one is just this all causes the subjectivity shift. Debate isn't the only thing that changes our minds our friends, family, religion, etc. And like living for another 70 years, debate only lasts 4. All of those things will also change us and change how we think about your arguments. Now, just some final recommendations. First are just a couple of books that you should read. Tuck and Yang, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, Grove, The Savage Ecology, and Juarez, The World is Burning. All of these and they might be a little bit long, so it's maybe just I do a ChatGPT summary or something of the sorts. Second is if you want to learn how to go for site call, you should watch Harker AS on chess. He debated 2 years ago in LD, and he went for this argument a lot, and he did it very persuasively. And he has a lot of rounds on YouTube. Um, this is him. Um, and so yeah, you should watch those. Um, Lastly is you should watch lectures on YouTube, both on going for and how to beat decay. Again, if you don't want to go for site call, there are a lot of other similar arguments around the same things.